Okay, guys there? Something happened, I got kicked out. In any case, this is Project Muse. You can search here. I'd probably do this one last. I'm muted. I'm not muted anymore, am I? Okay. Yeah, I don't know why it kicked me off. I think the internet went down over here or something. But I just went on my hotspot. All right, so all those are linked here. Hopefully this little tutorial helps a little bit, but you know, I've been helping people find sources. So if you have a thesis and you're lacking a source, you know, email me, send me your thesis. I'll find an article or two for you that could be good, but maybe those search techniques will help you, hopefully. All right, I want to get into the 20th century stuff for today also. So that was a detour. The new unit is here. The last unit of study is the 20th century. All the usual suspects are here. Here's where you can submit essay number 2. That one is due next Tuesday, as I was mentioning. Might as well talk about discussion number 9, which is due Friday. It's on the importance of being earnest. So that one, the post is due Friday, and then the replies are due Monday. I can give you a little bit of a grace period on that if you're finishing up your paper. You just shoot me an email and let me know. So this one is about the satire in the importance of being earnest. And it's asking you to compare and contrast that satire with the satire that we see in Gulliver's Travels. So remember that compare and contrast is a specific type of writing, right? And you need to present item A, which in this case would be the importance of being earnest, and then you present item B and bounce it off of the ideas in item A. So for example, what happens a lot, and the reason that people lose points on compare and contrast sometimes, is that people will say, oh, here's all about the satire in the importance of being earnest, and here's all about the satire in Gulliver's Travels. The end. And presenting two things is not comparing and contrasting. You have to draw the comparisons and state the contrasts, right? Like you have to make the connections. So say, for example, I was comparing these two writing implements, right? If I write a response or an essay or whatever I'm writing, and I'm supposed to compare contrast, and I say, here's a blue pen. It's good for making notes. It is a ballpoint pen, and it has a little clip on it so that I can put it on my pocket or on my notebook. This is a highlighter. It is yellow, and I use it to highlight stuff in my books. The end. I didn't compare and contrast them. I just told you the properties of this one, and then I told you the properties of this one. But if I was comparing and contrasting, I would say I can use both of these as a tool to annotate in my text. Both of them have a clip so that I can, you know, keep them with me. However, they're different because I use this one just to highlight, not to write notes. And this one is for note writing. This is blue, this is yellow. So I have to make those connections in my essay. So I'm gonna be writing, probably you wanna introduce the sort of properties of satire and the importance of being earnest. And then you need to bring in the properties of satire from Gulliver's Travels, and then say, these are the similarities and these are the differences, right? Like, so as you're talking about Gulliver, you can say, just like in Ernest, or contrasting from, you know, Ernest, so that you can make those connections. So it says, compare and contrast the Victorian satire we see in the importance of being earnest with the 18th century satire exhibited by part 1 of Gulliver's Travels. Consider Wilde and Swift's narrative techniques, purposes, characters, themes, and subject matter. So I'm giving you some things that you could compare and contrast. What do these satires tell us about their surface versus their deeper values? So that's an element of compare and contrast. So the people who do the best on that last discussion will make sure that they draw those comparisons or say this is how they're different. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this week is kind of jammed up with stuff, so if you have questions about the discussions, you can email those to me also, and I will help you. Okay, now let's get into the 20th century. There's some background for you to read on introduction, also literary modernism and postmodernism. I'm going to touch on it a little bit today with the PowerPoint that I'm going to do as an introduction to 20th and 21st century literature. This is the PowerPoint I'm going to use today, so you can click on that. If you want to get your own copy, you should be able to download it. So I'm going to take this last little bit of class here to go over 20th and 21st century literature. On Thursday, we will go over the poetry, and then next week there are 2 short stories to read, and then we're finished. So I'll go over Thursday's assignment and where you can find that when I finish with this PowerPoint. So 20th and 20th century literature. We don't have a lot to say yet about 21st century literature because we've only had 20 years in this century. So looking back, we'll probably be able to notice some differences, but the majority of the readings in our textbook focus on 20th century literature because that century has been completed. I put this image, this is from Picasso. I put this image in because Picasso was painting at the turn of the century, but also because I feel like this image embodies the concepts of 20th century literature. We have a figure who is, obviously his eyebrows make him look worried, concerned. You can see that he's absorbing the background, which is sort of bleak and dark. And as he absorbs that, he's got this sort of isolated, far away, worried look. And I think that sort of embodies the 20th century view of literature. You can see that I have behind me this image of World War I. I'll get out of the way for a second there. The reason that I chose this is because when you think about 20th century modernist writing, you should think about war. 20th century begins with war, and it really does color a lot of the literature that we see coming out, because as soon as World War I ended, there's just a short turnaround before we have World War II. So the first half of the 20th century is basically war, so historically. So obviously the writers were influenced by that. So there are some historical considerations. I don't know why I put that on there. Everybody knows what the 20th century is. But one of the main features of the 20th century is this unsettled feeling. Part of that is because of the wars, but part of that is also just because there have been a lot of changes in society. There are some new fields of study like sociology, psychology. That's all new. That the study of human thought and the human psyche, all that stuff is new. There are some everyday changes like electricity. You might think, well, what's the big deal? But think about the difference when your power goes out between your life, right? Your life between having electricity and not having electricity. And it's annoying to us, but imagine going the other direction and going from not having electricity and using lamps and candles and stuff like that to a switch where you have electricity. And what does that mean? For a lot of people, that was really uncomfortable. Think about how many changes we've had in the last year, going from a normal life to this, kind of COVID existence. Those kinds of changes are upsetting to people as a whole. So the speed at which things are changing makes people feel a little bit unsettled. Now we have more mass marketed medications, we have transportation, we have appliances to help us do things quicker. Like washing machines and so on. So the pace of life is increasing. And for a lot of people, that was kind of scary. We also have women's suffrage passing in 1928 in the UK. In the United States, it was a little bit earlier. So when we talk about this time period, undoubtedly it is shrouded with war. The World War One and World War Two are significant topics in American history, but we didn't have the war front here on our shores. We went overseas to fight in the Pacific and the European theaters, but it didn't come here, the actual fighting. But in Britain it did, and they were bombed and their entire cities were destroyed. And so that has, in some ways, a more profound effect on society and the people of the time and the writers of the time. So when World War One started, it started for various reasons, but mainly in the Balkans. That's not really important to the British people, but quickly took over Europe. And so the UK is unable to continue with colonialism. They're unable to keep their hand in all of the British Empire. And so they retract a bit and end up letting a lot of those colonial areas take over power themselves. So Britain will help them and they're part of the Commonwealth, but they're not under British control directly. After World War One, there's a lot of, just like in America, economic depression. I would say it was probably worse in the UK because of the rubble that exists. If you ever watched Saving Private Ryan or any of those movies that depict the European theater during World War One or World War Two, that's what we're talking about. Like just whole towns that are just rubble, and how do you start building from that? Well, they had to, and just about the time that they started was when World War II broke out. World War One was especially traumatic also because of the nature of the fighting in World War One. This is where we get trench warfare. If you ever watched the movie Wonder Woman, the first one, that takes place during World War One, and there's a couple of parts of that movie where they're in the trench that they've dug in, but the trench warfare is especially gruesome and pretty horrible. So about 16 million people died in World War One. World War Two follows on its heels. There's the era in between of the 1930s, and then we go right into World War Two, which just sort of further demolished everything that was part of their civilization. They had to rebuild. There's also a lot of immigration that happens after World War Two that British people weren't used to. And so they had to sometimes rethink what it meant to be British. There's sort of a revolving door. Some people were leaving the Commonwealth and going to places like America and other locations, and some people were emigrating to Britain. So maybe if people are coming from Africa or, you know, Asian countries, then they're coming to settle and raise families and have new citizens that have different ethnic origins. And that was kind of new for Britain. So there's this sort of question about what makes somebody British and what are the qualities of a British person. And so all that just adds to the unsettling notion of the time period. Another important element that kind of gets tossed over a bit in history books is the Troubles in Ireland. Ireland, for many years, and probably still, has been wanting to break away from British rule. They want to be their own sovereign nation, but they're part of the UK, so that doesn't work. So for many years they did, but they also had in the 1960s, not just that issue, but also the issue of civil war. North Ireland, for religious reasons, wanted to break away from the whole of Ireland. So there's a lot of infighting and civil war going on during that time. So that's why I say, when you think of modernism and you think of 20th century, you have to think about the influence of war on British literature. All right, so when we talk about characteristics of 20th century literature, on Thursday, I'm going to talk about the qualities of poetry in the 20th century, starting with some Imagist poems. Imagism is poetry that's just like a little snapshot. They're very short, sometimes only a few lines, but the idea is that they're capturing like a photograph. The image, the metaphor I like best is, imagine that a door swings open, you can see in there, and then it closes. And it's just capturing that one little moment in time. That's Imagism. We're going to look at an Imagist poet on Thursday. In the mid 20th century, we have what's called postmodernism, which is what came after the bleak outlook of modernism. And postmodernism has to do with, you know, the meaning of human existence. And so a lot of the poetry is about, why am I here? What's the purpose? What, you know, that kind of thing. And in the late 20th century, we have diversity. Because of the influx of immigrants, we have a variety of different voices coming through in the late 20th century poetry and into the 21st century. In fiction, in the early 20th century, we have modernism, which is that reaction to war and kind of like the idea of what is the human purpose on this planet if we're just going to fight each other. What's the goal? In the mid-century, we have more of a realism, the idea of wanting more out of life and depicting life as it really is, which is often disappointing. So a lot of the fiction is like that in the late 20th century. We have diversity, just like we do with poetry. With drama, we're not going to read any 20th century British drama, but you should know that the early 20th century, we have dramatists who were trying to challenge complacency, or the idea that we should just accept the status quo. In the middle 20th century, we have more of a minimalist approach, a lot of plays with no sets and just actors sort of setting the scene in order to criticize society. And then late 20th century, a lot more about diverse voices, and that's pretty much across the board with late 20th century. And also legal reform, you know, like making laws that benefit all people, and dramas that are about that. Here are some key authors. I'll point out which ones we're going to read. Virginia Woolf, we're going to read a piece by her called The Mark on the Wall. James Joyce, we're not going to read anything in this cycle from James Joyce, but you'll remember that first semester we read Araby. He's the writer of Araby. Yeats, we're going to read a piece by Yeats on Thursday, a poet. Dylan Thomas, we're going to read Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night for Thursday. Seamus Heaney is a late 20th century writer. He died, I think, in 2012 or 2013. He's the one who translated Beowulf in our textbook, and we're going to read a poem by him. He's a poet in his own right, Blackberry Picking. And Margaret Atwood. So we also consider writers of the Commonwealth, which would be Canada and Australia, sort of like arms of British literature. So Margaret Atwood is Canadian. We're not going to read anything from her, but you might know her work. She wrote the novel The Handmaid's Tale, which they made into a big long series on Hulu, if you've watched that. Chinua Achebe is Nigerian. He wrote the novel Things Fall Apart and many other works. He was dual citizenship, I think, Nigeria and Britain. And Samuel Beckett was an Irish playwright. So we're not reading any plays, but I just thought that I'd introduce you to the major players of the 20th century there. Are there any questions about the topics that I presented as an introduction to 20th century literature? All right, for Thursday, if you go to readings for Unit 6, for Thursday, we're going to talk about these 5 poems. They're all very short, or somewhat short, less than a page. So it'd be good if you look those over, and I'll point out some of the qualities of 20th century literature as we go through these poems. And then next week, we have the mark on the wall and the garden party, and that's the end of our selections for this term. If you want a PDF that just has the poetry selections in it, then here's the PDF that you can use if you don't want to go through that jumbo PDF with the textbook in it. All right, I know that we went a little bit fast today, but hopefully you got some good information to help you with your research and also some background for our last unit. Any lingering questions or anything that I didn't touch on that you wanted to know about for today? Everybody's good?